The Boeing 737 shuddered as it hit another pocket of turbulence, and Maya Chen gripped her armrest with fingers that had once steadied fighter jets through barrel rolls at Mach 2. Now those same hands trembled slightly as she stared out the small, oval window at the storm clouds gathering below. Lightning flickered like camera flashes against the darkening sky, and she found herself calculating wind shear patterns out of pure instinct, habit that died hard even 3 years after she'd turned in her wings. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. The voice crackled through the intercom, professional, but carrying an edge that made Maya's trained ear perk up. We're experiencing some weather ahead, so we're going to ask everyone to return to their seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing procedures. Maya glanced at her watch. 7:43 p.m. They weren't supposed to land in Denver for another 45 minutes. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the familiar surge of adrenaline that came when something wasn't quite right. She'd felt this same electricity in the cockpit of her F-18 Hornet during her 8 years in the Navy. That split-second awareness when routine became crisis. The elderly man in 14B beside her was clutching a rosary, his weathered fingers working the beads with practiced devotion. "Haven't been in weather this rough since my tour in Vietnam," he murmured, catching Maya's eye. "Name's Frank Reeves. You seem calmer than most folks." "Maya Chen," she replied, extending her hand. "And you're right, I've been through worse." She didn't elaborate. Most people didn't need to know about the time she'd landed a damaged Hornet on a carrier deck in 12-foot swells, or the night she'd guided her squadron through a sandstorm over Afghanistan that had turned the sky the color of dried blood. Across the aisle in 14D, a young mother named Sarah was trying to calm her 6-year-old daughter, Emma, who was crying softly into a well-worn stuffed elephant. "It's okay, baby," Sarah whispered, her own voice tight with worry. "Just like a roller coaster, remember? We talked about this." The plane lurched suddenly to the left, hard enough that the overhead bins groaned and several passengers gasped. Maya's eyes automatically went to the emergency exits, 2 rows forward, 3 rows back, and she mentally calculated evacuation times and procedures. Old habits. The flight attendant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, was making her way down the aisle with the practiced grace of someone who'd weathered thousands of flights. "How are we doing back here?" she asked, pausing at Maya's row. Her name tag read Linda. "We're fine," Maya said, then lowered her voice. "How's the crew holding up?" Linda's eyes sharpened slightly. There was something in Maya's tone, the calm authority that came from years of command, that made her pause. "You military?" "Was Navy pilot." Maya kept her voice low, not wanting to alarm the other passengers. Linda nodded slowly. "Captain Mayers has 22 years with the airline. If anyone can get us through this, it's him." But there was something in her expression that suggested she was reassuring herself as much as Maya. The plane shook again, more violently this time, and the lights flickered. Emma's crying grew louder, and Frank muttered another prayer. Maya found herself studying the other passengers, a businessman in 12A, who kept checking his phone despite the flight attendant's earlier announcement. A teenage girl in 15F who was listening to music with her eyes closed, trying to pretend nothing was happening. An older woman in 16C who was quietly knitting despite the turbulence, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. These were her people. Now, not her squadron, not her wingmen, but the 137 souls she found herself inexplicably responsible for in this aluminum tube, hurtling through an increasingly violent sky. She'd left the military to escape exactly this feeling, the weight of other people's lives in her hands, but some burdens she was learning couldn't be outrun. "Folks, this is Captain Myers again." The intercom crackled with static. "We've Got some significant weather between us and Denver, so we're going to divert to Colorado Springs. Should have you on the ground in about 20 minutes. Thanks for your patience. 20 minutes. Maya closed her eyes and let her training take over, running through scenarios. Diversions weren't uncommon, but something about the captain's tone, the way Linda's smile hadn't quite reached her eyes, the unusual turbulence patterns, it all added up to a picture that made her increasingly uneasy. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the number she hadn't called in 2 years. David Kim, her former radar intercept officer, now worked air traffic control at Peterson Air Force Base, which was practically next door to Colorado Springs Airport. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. What would she even say? That she had a feeling something was wrong? The plane dropped suddenly, as if it had fallen off a cliff, and several people screamed. The oxygen masks didn't deploy, which meant they weren't in immediate danger, but Maya's instincts were screaming now. She'd flown through storms before both. As a passenger and a pilot, and this felt different. Wrong, Maya? Frank was looking at her with concern. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. She realized she was staring at her phone with an intensity that probably looked alarming. Just checking something, she said, forcing a smile. But inside, her mind was racing through possibilities. Equipment failure, navigation problems, hydraulic issues. The storm was definitely a factor, but experienced airline pilots dealt with weather all the time. What wasn't she seeing? Linda appeared at her elbow again, leaning down to speak quietly. The captain asked me to see if there are any military pilots on board, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not that we need. I mean, it's just protocol in certain situations. Maya's blood ran cold. Airlines didn't ask for military pilots unless something was seriously compromised. What kind of situation? She asked, keeping her voice level. Probably nothing, Linda said quickly. Just, are you current on your certifications? I maintained my commercial license, Maya replied automatically, though her heart was now hammering against her ribs. What's going on? Before Linda could answer, the plane banked sharply to the right, and through her window, Maya could see city lights below, too many city lights for where they should be. They weren't heading toward Colorado Springs. They were flying over what looked like Denver, but in the wrong direction and at the wrong altitude. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Without thinking, she glanced down at the screen. The message was from a number she didn't recognize, but the content made her blood freeze. Maya Chen, Seat 14C, United Flight 1247. We know who you are. Check your encrypted COM app. A T.C. Peterson. Maya's hands began to shake for real now. She hadn't used her encrypted military communication app in 3 years. Hadn't even thought about it. How did Peterson Air Force Base know she was on this flight? How did they have her civilian phone number? And why were they contacting her? With trembling fingers, she opened the app, which required her thumbprint and a 6-digit code she somehow still remembered. A message was waiting. Commander Chun. This is Colonel Martinez, Peterson ATC. Your aircraft has experienced a communication failure. Primary and secondary radio systems are down. GPS navigation compromised. Captain Mayers is flying on backup instruments only. We need your help to establish contact and guide them to safe landing. Can you assist? Maya stared at the message, her mind reeling. She wasn't Commander Chun anymore. She was just Maya, a software consultant from Seattle who'd spent the last 3 years trying to forget the weight of command, the burden of making split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. She'd left that life behind after what happened over the Persian Gulf, after Lieutenant Rodriguez hadn't made it home because of a call she'd made. But as she looked around the cabin, at Frank with his rosary, at Sarah holding her daughter, at Linda whose professional calm was starting to crack around the edges, She realized that some responsibilities didn't care whether you wanted them or not. She typed back quickly, "Roger, Peterson. I'm here. What do you need me to do?" The response came immediately. "Stand by. Patching you through to emergency frequency. Your captain doesn't know you're on board yet. We need you to establish contact with flight deck and relay our instructions. Storm system has knocked out ground communications across the region. You're our only link to that aircraft." Maya closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of command settling back onto her shoulders like an old, heavy coat. When she opened them, Frank was watching her with interest. "You know," he said quietly, "in Vietnam, we had a saying, some people run toward the sound of gunfire, and some people run away. You can always tell which is which when the shooting starts." Maya looked at him, then at the other passengers. Then at her phone where Colonel Martinez was waiting for her response. Outside, the storm was getting worse, and somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Myers was fighting to keep them all alive with failing instruments and no communication with the ground. She took a deep breath and began typing. "Peterson, this is Commander Chen. I'm ready to assist." The plane lurched again, and Maya closed her eyes briefly, remembering why she'd left the cockpit behind 3 years ago. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice still echoed in her dreams sometimes, asking for clearance on the mission that would be his last. She'd built a quiet life in Seattle to escape exactly this feeling, the weight of other people's lives depending on her decisions. Her daily routine was carefully constructed normalcy. Coffee at 6 a.m. sharp, made in the same blue ceramic mug she'd bought at Pike Place Market during her first week in Seattle. 20 minutes of yoga on a mat, positioned precisely perpendicular to her living room window, facing the Space Needle. Shower, dress in one of 7 nearly identical business casual outfits. Check email, grab her laptop bag, and catch the 7:45 bus to downtown. At work, she was known as the person who could solve impossible problems, who could look at thousands of lines of code and immediately spot the one error that was causing the entire system to crash. Her colleagues respected her precision and her calm under pressure, but they didn't really know her. She ate lunch alone, reading technical manuals or novels about ordinary people living ordinary lives. She'd never told them about her military background, never mentioned that she could calculate fuel consumption and wind vectors in her head, or that she still woke up sometimes at 04:00 hours in a cold sweat, dreaming about orange flames and radio static. She'd tried dating Mark, a graphic designer who made her laugh and cooked elaborate weekend brunches. David, a doctor who shared her love of hiking and had patient hands that reminded her too much of James's. Lisa, a teacher whose enthusiasm for life had been infectious. Until Maya realized she was trying too hard to be someone she wasn't. Each relationship had followed the same pattern: initial connection, careful sharing of edited histories, the inevitable moment when her date would ask about her past and she'd deflect with a joke or change the subject. Eventually, they all sensed the wall she'd built around herself and drifted away. The irony wasn't lost on her that she'd become an expert at debugging systems but couldn't fix whatever was broken inside herself. Her sister Katie called every Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific Time, a ritual Maya had come to depend on more than she cared to admit. Katie was 2 years younger, a pediatric nurse in Boston with twin 4-year-olds and a husband who coached Little League. She was everything Maya had once thought she might become: settled, content, building something lasting with someone who knew all her secrets and loved her anyway. "You sound tired," Katie had said during their last call, 3 days before Maya's flight to Denver for a client meeting. "Are you sleeping?" "I'm fine," Maya had replied automatically, the same response she'd given for 3 years. Maya. Katie's voice had carried that particular mix of love and exasperation that only siblings could master. "When's the last time you did something that scared you? Something that reminded you who you really are?" "I'm figuring out who I really am." Maya had protested. That's the whole point. No, you're hiding from who you really are. There's a difference. Katie was wrong. Maya had told herself. She wasn't hiding. She was healing. She was building a new life where her decisions didn't put other people at risk, where she could control the variables and predict the outcomes. Software didn't bleed. Code didn't have families who would grieve if she made the wrong choice. But sitting in 14C with her phone buzzing with messages from Peterson Air Force Base, Maya realized that Katie might have been right after all. She'd spent 3 years trying to become ordinary, trying to convince herself that she was just another passenger on the journey of life. But some people, as Frank had said, ran toward the sound of gunfire. And despite all her efforts to change, she was apparently still one of them. Her hands moved automatically as she opened the encrypted app and began reading the technical details Colonel Martinez was sending. Primary radio dead, backup radio intermittent, GPS showing erratic readings, weather radar compromised. Captain Mayers was essentially flying blind through one of the worst storm systems to hit Colorado in years, with 137 people depending on his skill and experience to get them safely to the ground. Maya found herself mentally reviewing emergency procedures she hadn't thought about in years. Approach patterns for Colorado Springs Airport, runway lengths and orientations, backup navigation techniques for instrument failures. The information was all still there, buried under 3 years of deliberate forgetting, but intact and readily accessible when she needed it. "Ma'am." Emma, the little girl across the aisle, was looking at her with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a pilot?" Sarah, Emma's mother, looked embarrassed. "Emma, don't bother the lady." "It's okay," Maya said, surprised by how natural it felt to smile at the child. "What makes you think I'm a pilot?" "You keep looking at the wings," Emma said solemnly. "And you're not scared like everyone else." Maya glanced around the cabin and realized Emma was right. While other passengers were gripping armrests, praying, or staring at their phones with worry, she was sitting calmly, her body automatically adjusting to the turbulence, her eyes tracking the aircraft's movements with professional interest rather than fear. "I used to be a pilot," Maya admitted. "A long time ago." "For the airlines?" Emma asked. "For the Navy." Emma's eyes widened. "Like Top Gun?" Maya laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. "Something like that." Frank leaned over, his voice low. "Navy pilot, huh? No wonder you seemed familiar with all this." "That was a different life," Maya said. But even as she said it, she knew it sounded hollow. "Was it?" Frank asked gently. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like it's the same person, just in civilian clothes." Maya's phone buzzed again. "Colonel Martinez. Commander, we need you to establish contact with the flight deck. Captain Myers needs to know he has an experienced military pilot on board who can assist with communications. Can you make your way to the cockpit?" Maya stared at the message, her heart pounding. She'd managed to avoid cockpits for 3 years, had turned down every opportunity to fly, had even driven to client meetings rather than take connecting flights when possible. The thought of being back in that environment, surrounded by instruments and the weight of responsibility, made her palms sweat. But then she looked at Emma, who was watching her with the kind of absolute trust that children reserved for adults. They believed could fix anything. She thought about Sarah, trying to be brave for her daughter while clearly terrified herself. She thought about Frank, whose weathered hands were steady on his rosary, but whose eyes held the wariness of someone who'd seen enough combat to recognize when a situation was truly dangerous. She thought about Lieutenant Rodriguez and the promise she'd made at his funeral to his wife and 2 young children. She'd sworn she would never again put anyone at risk because of her decisions. But maybe, she realized now, the greater risk was in not making any decisions at all. Maya unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her legs remarkably steady despite the turbulence. "I need to talk to the flight crew," she told Linda, who was passing by with a concerned expression. "Ma'am, I need you to remain seated, Linda." Maya's voice carried the quiet authority she'd once used to direct fighter squadrons through hostile airspace. "I'm Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen, U.S. Navy retired. Peterson Air Force Base has been in contact with me through secure channels. Your captain has lost communication with air traffic control, and they need me to serve as a relay." Linda's eyes widened, and Maya could see the moment when the flight attendant's training kicked in, the recognition that in emergency situations, any qualified personnel could be pressed into service. "Are you current on your certifications?" Linda asked. "Yes," Maya lied smoothly. She was current on her commercial license, but she hadn't flown anything more complex than a Cessna in 3 years. Still, the principles were the same, and some knowledge never truly faded. "I'll need to verify this with the captain," Linda said, but she was already moving toward the cockpit, her body language shifting from concerned flight attendant to professional. Dealing with an emergency situation, Maya followed her forward, her phone clutched in her hand as Colonel Martinez continued to send updates. The storm was intensifying, with winds gusting to 60 knots and visibility near zero. 3 other aircraft had already diverted to alternate airports, and Colorado Springs was quickly becoming the only viable option for landing in the region. As they approached the cockpit door, Maya caught her reflection in the galley's stainless steel surface. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. The woman looking back at her had the same determined expression she remembered from her Navy days, the same set to her shoulders that had once inspired confidence in young pilots under her command. Katie had been right, she hadn't changed who she was. She'd just been hiding from it. Linda knocked on the cockpit door, spoke quietly into the intercom, and waited. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened to reveal Captain Myers, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, and the kind of steady demeanor that came from decades of flying in all conditions. "You're the Navy pilot?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Commander Maya Chen, retired. I have Peterson Air Force Base on secure communications. They're standing by to relay navigation and weather information." Captain Myers studied her for a moment, taking in her calm demeanor and the way she automatically positioned herself to see the instrument panel. "How current are you?" "Current enough," Maya said, meeting his eyes steadily. "And right now, I'm the only communication link you have with the ground." The captain nodded slowly. "Come on up. Let's see what we're dealing with." As Maya stepped into the cockpit for the first time in 3 years, she felt something inside her chest loosen, a tension she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. The familiar layout of instruments, the subtle vibration of the aircraft through the controls, the focused intensity of pilots managing a challenging situation, it all felt like coming home to a place she'd tried to convince herself she no longer belonged. She was no longer just another passenger in 14C. She was Commander Chen again. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt exactly right. The cockpit of United Flight 1247 was a study in controlled tension. Captain Myers sat in the left seat, his hands steady on the controls, despite the fact that most of his instruments were either dark or showing erratic readings. First Officer Jennifer Walsh, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and precise movements, was working through emergency checklists with the methodical calm of someone who'd trained for this exact scenario hundreds of times but never hoped to use it. "Talk to me about what we're dealing with," Maya said, sliding into the jump seat behind the captain and immediately scanning the instrument panel with practiced efficiency. "Primary radio failed about 20 minutes ago," Captain Myers replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Backup radio is intermittent. We can hear ground control sometimes, but they can't hear us. GPS is showing our position as somewhere over Kansas, which is obviously wrong. Weather radar went dark 15 minutes ago, right when we hit the worst of this storm system." Maya nodded, her fingers flying over her phone as she relayed the information to Colonel Martinez. The response came back immediately. Electrical system failure likely caused by lightning strike. Multiple redundant systems compromised. Advise aircraft is currently 47 miles northeast of Colorado Springs. Altitude 12,000 feet on heading 240 degrees. Storm cell moving east-southeast. Clear corridor opening in approximately 8 minutes on heading 180 degrees. Peterson says you're 47 miles northeast of Colorado Springs. Maya reported, reading directly from her phone. They're tracking you on military radar. There's a clear corridor opening up in 8 minutes on a heading of 180 degrees. First Officer Walsh looked up from her checklist. How do we know we can trust this information? It was a fair question. Maya pulled up Colonel Martinez's credentials on her phone and showed them the screen. Colonel Martinez is the senior air traffic controller at Peterson Air Force Base. He's got access to military radar systems that are more sophisticated than civilian equipment. Plus, he's patching through weather data from NOAA and the National Weather Service. Captain Myers was quiet for a moment, processing the information. I've been flying for 22 years, he said finally. Never had a complete communication failure like this. But I've also never been in a storm system this severe with this many variables. He looked at Maya in the reflection of the windscreen. What's your assessment, Commander? The title hit Maya like a physical blow. She hadn't been called Commander in 3 years, and hearing it now brought back a flood of memories, both good and terrible. But she pushed them aside and focused on the present situation. The storm system is massive, she said, relaying what Martinez was telling her in real time. It extends from Denver south to Pueblo and west to the mountains. But it's moving, and there are gaps. If we can thread the needle through the clear corridors, we can get you to Colorado Springs safely. And if we can't? First Officer Walsh asked. Maya hesitated, then decided on honesty. Peterson is saying conditions at Denver International are deteriorating rapidly. They've already closed 2 runways due to wind shear. Colorado Springs is your best option, but only if we can get there in the next 30 minutes. The aircraft shuddered as it hit another patch of severe turbulence, and Maya heard several passengers cry out from the cabin behind them. She thought of Emma, probably terrified and clinging to her mother. She thought of Frank, who's steady. Faith was being tested by circumstances beyond his control. She thought of Linda and the other flight attendants, who were undoubtedly struggling to keep the passengers calm while dealing with their own fears. There's something else, she said, reading another message from Martinez. Peterson is coordinating with Colorado Springs Airport to have emergency services standing by. They're treating this as a full emergency landing. Captain Myers nodded grimly. Standard protocol given our equipment failures. Better to be prepared for the worst-case scenario. For the next few minutes, Maya served as the crucial link between the aircraft and the ground, relaying heading changes, altitude adjustments, and weather updates with the precision of someone who'd done this job for years. But as they began their approach to Colorado Springs, she realized that her role was about to become much more complicated. Commander, Martinez's message read, we're showing a new problem. Aircraft's primary hydraulic system pressure is dropping. Captain needs to be advised that landing gear extension may be compromised. We're recommending manual gear extension procedures. Maya's blood ran cold. Hydraulic failure on top of everything else was a nightmare scenario. Without hydraulic pressure, the pilots would lose power steering. The landing gear might not deploy properly, and the brakes could fail. She'd seen aircraft make successful landings with hydraulic failures, but it required skill, luck, and perfect conditions, none of which they currently had. Captain, she said quietly, Peterson is showing hydraulic pressure dropping in the primary system. Captain Myers immediately checked his instruments, and Maya could see his jaw tighten as he confirmed the reading. Jennifer, start running through the hydraulic failure checklist. We may need to extend the gear manually. First Officer Walsh was already pulling out the emergency procedures manual, but Maya could see the stress beginning to show in the slight tremor of her hands. This was rapidly becoming a textbook case of cascading failures, the kind of emergency scenario that flight crews train for, but hoped never to encounter. "How many people are we responsible for?" Maya asked, though she already knew the answer. 137 passengers, 5 crew members, Captain Myers replied. "Plus 1 Navy pilot who's keeping us connected to the real world." Maya felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. These weren't just numbers. They were people with families, dreams, fears, and hopes. People like Emma, who trusted that the adults around her would keep her safe. People like Sarah, who was probably fighting her own terror to stay strong for her daughter. People like Frank, whose simple faith was being tested by circumstances that seemed increasingly dire. Her phone buzzed with another message from Martinez. "Commander, we need you to be prepared for the possibility that you may need to assist with manual flight controls if hydraulic pressure continues to drop. Are you current on 737 systems?" Maya stared at the message, her heart pounding. She was qualified on military aircraft, but civilian airliners were different beasts entirely. Similar principles, but different procedures, different systems, different responses to emergency situations. She'd studied 737 systems as part of her commercial license requirements, but studying and actually flying were two very different things. "Commander?" Captain Myers was looking at her with concern. "Everything all right?" Maya realized she'd been staring at her phone for several seconds without responding. "Peterson is asking about my familiarity with 737 systems," she said honestly. "They want to know if I can assist with manual flight controls if the hydraulic situation gets worse." Captain Myers and First Officer Walsh exchanged a look. "What's your experience with civilian aircraft?" Walsh asked. "I maintained my commercial license after leaving the Navy," Maya said. "I've studied 737 systems, but I haven't actually flown one. Most of my experience is in fighter aircraft F-18 Hornets, some trainer aircraft, a few civilian single-engine planes for currency requirements." "Fighter experience is actually helpful," Captain Myers said thoughtfully. "You're used to making quick decisions under pressure, and the basic principles of flight are the same regardless of the aircraft. If we need a third set of hands, you'd be better than nothing." Maya nodded, but privately she was terrified. Flying a fighter jet was like riding a motorcycle, fast, agile, responsive to the slightest input. Flying an airliner was like driving a bus, heavy, methodical, requiring smooth, deliberate inputs. The muscle memory was similar, but the application was completely different. Another message from Martinez. "Hydraulic pressure now at 40% and dropping. Advise crew to begin preparation for manual gear extension. Weather corridor is holding open, but you need to begin descent immediately to take advantage of it." "We need to start our descent now," Maya relayed. "The clear corridor is still open, but it won't be for long." And Peterson confirms that hydraulic pressure is continuing to drop. Captain Myers nodded and began the descent, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. But Maya could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept flicking to the hydraulic pressure gauge, the slight stiffness in his movements that suggested he was preparing for the worst. As they descended through 8,000 feet, the turbulence actually began to decrease. They were dropping below the worst of the storm, into the clear corridor that Martinez had identified. For a moment, Maya allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it through this without any more complications. That was when the lights went out. Not completely, the emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the cockpit in an eerie red glow, but the main electrical system had failed. Most of the instruments went dark, leaving only the essential flight controls and a handful of backup systems running on battery power. "Well," Captain Myers said with The kind of dark humor that Maya remembered from her military days. At least we're not bored. First Officer Walsh was already running through the electrical failure checklist, but Maya could see that they were rapidly running out of options. No radios, intermittent instruments, failing hydraulics, and now electrical problems. They were essentially flying a very expensive glider with unreliable controls through a gap in one of the worst storms in Colorado history. "Peterson, we've lost main electrical," Maya typed frantically into her phone. "Running on battery backup only." "What's our current position and distance to the airport?" The response came back immediately. 22 miles southwest of Colorado Springs Airport. "You're lined up perfectly for runway 35R, descent rate good, airspeed on target. Emergency services are standing by. You're going to make it, Commander." Maya looked at Captain Myers, who was hand-flying the aircraft with the skill of someone who'd learned to fly before computers took over most of the work. She looked at First Officer Walsh, who was methodically working through emergency procedures with the calm professionalism of someone who refused to be defeated by circumstances. And for the first time in 3 years, Maya felt something she'd forgotten she was capable of feeling: pride in being part of a team that didn't give up when things got difficult. 22 miles out, she reported. "We're lined up for runway 35R, Peterson says we're going to make it." "Of course we are," Captain Myers said, and Maya could hear the absolute certainty in his voice. "We've got the best backup ground control in the business, an experienced crew, and apparently a guardian angel in seat 14C who decided to take this particular flight at exactly the right time." Maya smiled, feeling something inside her chest that she hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with people who understood that some challenges were meant to be faced head-on rather than avoided. They still had to land a crippled aircraft in challenging conditions, with minimal instruments and failing systems. But for the first time since stepping onto this flight, Maya was beginning to believe they actually could pull it off. As they descended through 5,000 feet, Maya realized that word of their situation had somehow spread beyond the cockpit. Her phone was buzzing with messages not just from Colonel Martinez, but from numbers she hadn't seen in years. David Kim, her former Rio, was somehow patched into the communication loop. Captain Sarah Rodriguez, no relation to the lieutenant she'd lost, was sending weather updates from Cheyenne Mountain. Even Admiral Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer, had sent a brief message: "Bring them home, Maya. That's an order." The Navy network had activated around her, and Maya felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed her professional composure. These people, her people, had never forgotten her, had never stopped considering her part of the family she'd tried so hard to leave behind. "Commander," Martinez's latest message read, "we're going to need you to take the controls for the final approach. Captain Myers is showing signs of fatigue, and First Officer Walsh needs to focus on manual gear extension procedures. Are you ready?" Maya stared at the message, her hands beginning to shake. She'd been dreading this moment, knowing it was a possibility but hoping it wouldn't come to pass. Taking control of a civilian airliner with 137 people on board was exactly the kind of responsibility she'd joined the military to escape, but as she looked at Captain Myers, she could see that he was indeed showing signs of stress fatigue. His movements were becoming slightly less precise, his responses a fraction of a second slower than they'd been 30 minutes ago. It wasn't his fault. He'd been fighting a nearly impossible situation for over an hour, making constant adjustments to compensate for failing systems, while maintaining the kind of calm professionalism that kept passengers from panicking. First Officer Walsh was deep in the manual gear extension checklist, physically pulling circuit breakers and operating backup systems that most pilots hoped never to use. She needed to focus entirely on that task, which meant someone else needed to fly the airplane. "Captain, Maya said quietly. "Peterson is recommending that I take the controls for final approach. You've been fighting this thing for an hour, and Jennifer needs to concentrate on getting the gear down." Captain Mayers looked at her in the dim red glow of the emergency lighting. "Are you comfortable with that?" Maya thought about Lieutenant Rodriguez, about the split-second decision that had ended his life. She thought about the 3 years she'd spent trying to convince herself that she was better off avoiding situations where people's lives depended on her choices. She thought about Emma, probably crying in her mother's arms, trusting that the adults in charge would get her safely to the ground. "No," she said honestly. "I'm terrified, but I'm ready." Captain Myers nodded slowly. "Your aircraft commander." Maya's hands closed around the control yoke, and immediately she felt the difference between flying a fighter and controlling a commercial airliner. The 737 was heavy, sluggish compared to her Hornet, requiring smooth, deliberate inputs rather than the quick, precise movements she was accustomed to. But the fundamental principles were the same: lift, thrust, drag, and weight, and her muscle memory began to adapt within seconds. "I have control," she announced, her voice carrying the authority she'd thought she'd lost forever. "You have control," Captain Myers confirmed, sliding his hands away from the yoke, but keeping them positioned to take over if necessary. Through her phone, Colonel Martinez was providing a steady stream of updates. Altitude 3,200 feet, airspeed 180 knots on glide path for runway 35R. Weather is holding winds 15 knots gusting to 25. Visibility 3 miles and improving. "You're doing great, Commander." But Maya could feel that something was still wrong. The aircraft was responding to her inputs, but there was a subtle asymmetry in the controls that suggested they had more problems than just hydraulics and electrical systems. She'd felt this sensation before, in a damaged Hornet limping back to the carrier after taking flak over Afghanistan. "Captain," she said, keeping her voice level, "I think we may have structural damage. The aircraft is pulling slightly to the right, and I'm having to hold constant left pressure to maintain heading." Captain Myers immediately began checking what instruments were still functional. Could be ice buildup on the wings, could be damage from the lightning strike, could be asymmetric fuel burn, he said. "Whatever it is, can you compensate?" "Yes, sir," Maya replied, making small adjustments to keep them aligned with the runway. "But it's going to make the landing more challenging." First Officer Walsh looked up from her checklist. "Gear extension is ready, but I need to warn you, we're going to have to drop it manually at the last possible moment. If we extend it too early, the drag will be enormous, and we may not have enough power to maintain approach speed." Maya nodded, her mind automatically calculating the timing. They'd need to extend the gear at about 500 feet above ground level, which would give them just enough time to confirm it was locked down before touchdown. It was a narrow window with no margin for error. Her phone buzzed with another message. This one from Admiral Hayes. "Maya, I'm watching the radar feed from Peterson. Your approach looks textbook perfect, despite everything you're dealing with. Trust your training. Trust your instincts. You've got this." Reading those words from her former commanding officer, a woman who'd never given praise lightly, Maya felt something inside her solidify. The doubt, the self-recrimination, the 3 years of hiding from her true nature all seemed to fall away. Leaving behind the pilot, she'd always been underneath the civilian disguise she'd tried to wear. 2 miles out, Martinez reported through her phone. Altitude 1,800 feet, airspeed on target. Colorado Springs Tower is standing by with emergency services. Fire and rescue positioned along the runway. Ambulances standing by. Everything is ready for your arrival. Maya could see the airport now through the windscreen, the runway lights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. But she could also see the rain still coming down, the windsock indicating gusting crosswinds that would make the landing even more challenging. 1 mile out, she announced to the cockpit crew. "Jennifer, prepare for gear extension on my mark." "Standing by," Walsh replied, her hand poised over the manual extension controls. Maya could feel the aircraft fighting her now, that structural damage or ice buildup making it increasingly difficult to maintain precise control. But she'd landed damaged aircraft before, and she knew that sometimes the key was not to fight the airplane's tendencies, but to work with them. "Half mile," she called out. 500 feet. Gear down now." First Officer Walsh activated the manual extension system, and Maya felt the aircraft shudder as the landing gear deployed. The drag was enormous, just as Walsh had predicted, and Maya had to add power to maintain their approach speed. "Gear down and locked," Walsh announced, checking her indicators. "All green lights." "Beautiful," Maya breathed, feeling the aircraft settle into its final approach configuration. They were committed now, no going around, no second chances. Either they made this landing work, or they'd be dealing with a much more serious emergency. 200 feet, Captain Myers called out, reading from one of the few instruments still. "Functioning. Airspeed 145 knots, looking good." Maya could see the runway threshold rushing toward them, the white stripes of the centerline perfectly aligned with their nose. The crosswind was pushing them slightly to the right, but she compensated with a small adjustment to the left, feeling the aircraft respond sluggishly but predictably. 100 feet, Myers called. 50 feet, 40, 30, 20. The main landing gear touched down with a solid thump that Maya felt through the control yoke. For a moment, the aircraft bounced slightly, and Maya held her breath, but then the nose gear came down, and they were rolling down the runway with all the emergency vehicles racing alongside them, their lights flashing in the darkness. Creating this intense story required significant time and effort to research aviation procedures and develop these complex characters. If you're finding yourself on the edge of your seat, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who appreciate stories of courage under pressure. "Brakes," Maya called out, and Captain Myers applied what pressure he could through the compromised hydraulic system. "Brakes," Maya called out, and Captain Myers applied what pressure he could through the compromised hydraulic system. The aircraft slowed gradually, much more slowly than normal, but they had plenty of runway length, and Maya could see they were going to stop well before the end. As they finally rolled to a complete stop, Maya realized she was shaking. Not with fear, but with the kind of adrenaline-fueled relief that came after successfully completing an impossible mission. She'd done it. They'd all done it together, her Captain Myers, First Officer Walsh, Colonel Martinez, and all the people on the ground who'd worked to bring them home safely. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Myers announced over the intercom, his voice hoarse with exhaustion but filled with satisfaction. "Welcome to Colorado Springs. We know this wasn't the smoothest flight you've ever taken, but thanks to some extraordinary teamwork, including assistance from a very special passenger, we're all safely on the ground." Maya heard cheering from the passenger cabin, and she realized that people were applauding. Not just polite, obligatory applause, but the kind of heartfelt celebration that came from people who understood they'd just experienced something extraordinary together. Her phone buzzed with a final message from Colonel Martinez. "Outstanding work, Commander. Peterson Air Force Base requests permission to welcome you home." Maya stared at the message, tears blurring her vision. Home. She'd spent 3 years trying to build a new home in Seattle, trying to become someone different, trying to forget the part of herself that thrived in situations exactly like this. But sitting in this cockpit, surrounded by people who'd trusted her with their lives and whom she'd trusted with hers, she realized that some definitions of home had nothing to do with geography. The emergency crews were surrounding the aircraft, now checking for damage, ensuring that all systems were safely shut down. Soon the passengers would be evacuated through the emergency slides as a precaution, and Maya would have to return to her seat in 14C and pretend to be just another passenger who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. But first, she had a phone call to make. "Maya?" Katie's voice was immediately concerned when she answered. "You weren't supposed to call until Sunday. Is everything okay?" "Katie," Maya said, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name, "I think I need to tell you about what I used to do for a living." "What do you mean? You're a software consultant." Maya looked around the cockpit, at Captain Myers, who was methodically shutting down systems, at First Officer Walsh, who was completing post-landing checklists with professional precision, at the King Kofke emergency vehicles surrounding them with their lights painting everything in reds and blues. "It's a long story," she said, "but I think it's time I stopped hiding from who I really am." 6 months later, Maya stood in the briefing room at Peterson Air Force Base, wearing a civilian flight suit with her name embroidered on the chest, Maya Chen, Emergency Response Coordinator. The room was filled with pilots, air traffic controllers, and emergency response personnel from across the Colorado region, all gathered for the monthly training session that had grown out of the events of that stormy night in October. "The key lesson from Flight 1247, Maya was saying to the assembled group, is that emergency situations require us to think beyond our normal procedures and protocols. Sometimes the resources you need are sitting in seat 14C, but you'll never know unless you're willing to ask for help and accept it from unexpected sources." Captain Myers, who had become a close friend and frequent collaborator, nodded from the front row. He'd been instrumental in developing the new protocols that allowed civilian and military aviation assets to coordinate more effectively during emergencies. First Officer Walsh, now promoted to captain herself, sat beside him, taking notes even though she'd helped write the training manual they were using. "The other thing we learned," Maya continued, "is that sometimes the best way to move forward is to stop running from your past and start integrating it into your future." After the emergency landing, Maya's life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. The story of Flight 1247 had made national news, not as a disaster, but as an example of extraordinary cooperation between civilian and military aviation assets. Maya had found herself fielding interview requests from news outlets, aviation magazines, and even a Hollywood producer who wanted to buy the rights to her story. But more importantly, she'd received a call from Admiral Hayes 3 days after the landing. "Maya," the Admiral had said without preamble, "I have a proposition for you. The Department of Transportation is creating a new position, Emergency Aviation Response Coordinator, for the Western United States. The job would involve developing protocols for exactly the kind of situation you handled on Flight 1247. Interested?" Maya had spent 3 years trying to escape the military world, but she'd discovered that what she'd really been trying to escape was the crushing weight of command responsibility, particularly after losing Lieutenant Rodriguez. The new position offered her a chance to use her skills and experience to help people, without carrying the burden of sending others into harm's way. "What would I be doing, exactly?" she'd asked. "Training civilian pilots and air traffic controllers in emergency procedures, developing communication protocols between civilian and military assets, creating rapid response teams for aviation emergencies. Basically, making sure that what happened on Flight 1247 becomes the standard response rather than a lucky accident." Maya had accepted the position immediately. The job had brought her back to Colorado, where she'd rented a small house in Colorado Springs with a view of Pikes Peak and a garage where she could work on restoring a 1967 Cessna 172 that she'd bought from a retired Air Force pilot. It was slow, methodical work that gave her hands something to do while her mind processed the changes in her life. She'd also started flying again, not commercially but as a volunteer with the Civil Air Patrol, participating in search and rescue missions and disaster relief efforts. The first time she'd climbed into the cockpit of a small aircraft after the emergency landing, her hands had shaken so badly she'd had to sit for 5 minutes before starting the engine. But once she was airborne, everything had felt natural. Again, as if she'd never stopped flying. The psychological aspect of emergency response, Maya told her current class, is just as important as the technical procedures. People perform better when they feel connected to something larger than themselves, when they understand that their individual actions are part of a coordinated team effort. Frank Reeves, the Vietnam veteran who'd been sitting in 14B, had become an unexpected friend. He'd reached out to Maya through the airline after the emergency landing, and they'd discovered a shared understanding of what it meant to carry responsibility for others' lives. Frank had started volunteering with a veteran support group, helping other former military personnel transition to civilian life, particularly those struggling with the same issues Maya had faced. The thing about combat veterans, Frank had told her over coffee one afternoon, is that we're trained to run toward danger, not away from it. The problem comes when we try to live in a world where there's no danger to run toward. We end up feeling useless, disconnected, like we don't have a purpose anymore. Frank had been right. Maya's 3 years in Seattle hadn't been healing. They'd been a form of self-imposed exile, cutting herself off from the very thing that gave her life, meaning. Sarah and Emma had also stayed in touch. Sarah had sent Maya a photo of Emma wearing a pilot's costume for Halloween, complete with aviator sunglasses and a toy headset. The accompanying note had read, "Emma says she wants to be just like the lady who helped fly our airplane. I think she could do worse for a role model." Maya had that photo on her desk now, next to a commendation letter from the FAA and a group photo of her current training class. But the item she treasured most was a handwritten letter from Admiral Hayes, received just last week. "Maya, I wanted you to know that the protocols you've developed are being implemented nationwide. Last month, a commercial flight with similar equipment failures made a successful emergency landing in Phoenix using procedures directly based on your Flight 1247 experience. The pilot credited your training materials with helping him stay calm under pressure and work effectively with military air traffic control. You've found a way to turn a personal tragedy into something that serves others. Lieutenant Rodriguez would be proud of what you've accomplished in his memory. More importantly, you should be proud of yourself for finding the courage to come home. Coming home." That phrase had taken on new meaning for Maya over the past 6 months. It wasn't about geography or career or even relationships, though she'd started dating again. And David, the emergency room doctor, had turned out to be both patient and understanding about her complicated history. Coming home had been about accepting all the different parts of herself: the military officer, the civilian consultant, the teacher, the pilot, the woman who'd made mistakes and learned from them. "Are there any questions about today's scenario?" Maya asked the training class. A young air traffic controller raised her hand. "Commander, what advice would you give to someone who's afraid of making the wrong decision in an emergency situation?" Maya smiled, remembering her own terror at taking control of Flight 1247's approach. "The wrong decision is usually the decision not to make any decision at all," she said. "In emergency situations, doing something is almost always better than doing nothing, even if it turns out not to be the perfect solution. You can adjust, you can adapt, you can correct course, but you can't help anyone if you're paralyzed by the fear of making a mistake." After the class ended, Maya walked outside into the crisp Colorado afternoon. The mountains were visible in the distance, snow-covered peaks against a brilliant blue sky that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Katie. "Saw the news story about your Phoenix training success. Proud of you, sis. Are you happy?" Maya thought about the question as she drove home. Was she happy? She was certainly busier than she'd been in Seattle, working longer hours and traveling more frequently. She was dealing with challenges every day, making decisions that affected other people's lives, carrying responsibility that she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. But she was also sleeping better than she had in years. She woke up each morning with a sense of purpose, knowing that her work mattered, that she was using her skills and experience to help people rather than hiding from them. She was part of a community, again, not just the aviation community, but a community of people who understood that some callings required you to put others' needs ahead of your own comfort. At home, she found a package waiting on her doorstep. Inside was a scale model of a Boeing 737 with a note: "Commander Chen, thank you for getting us home safely. Emma starts pilot lessons next month. She's 8 now and very determined. We hope someday she'll be half as brave as you are. With gratitude always, Sarah and Emma Morrison." Maya set the model airplane on her bookshelf next to her other aviation memorabilia, medals and commendations that she'd finally taken out of storage, photos of her squadron from her Navy days, and a framed copy of her commercial pilot's license. With her updated address in Colorado Springs, her phone rang, and she recognized Colonel Martinez's number. "Evening, Commander. Are you free for a quick consultation? We have a situation developing over Kansas, severe weather, multiple aircraft affected, and it looks like we might need to activate some of those protocols you've been developing." Maya felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the same feeling she'd experienced in the cockpit of Flight 1247, when she'd realized that people were depending on her to help them navigate through a crisis. "I'll be right there," she said, already reaching for her keys. As she drove back toward Peterson Air Force Base, Maya realized that Katie's question had been easier to answer than she'd initially thought. Was she happy? Maybe happiness wasn't the right word. She was fulfilled. She was useful. She was home. And for the first time in years, that felt like enough. 3 years later, Maya stood at the podium in the main auditorium at the Air Force Academy, looking out at an audience of cadets, officers, and aviation professionals who had gathered for the annual Aviation Safety Symposium. The nameplate in front of her read, "Dr. Maya Chen, Director of Emergency Aviation Response, Western Region," reflecting the doctorate in aviation safety she'd completed through a combination of her military experience and her work developing the emergency response protocols that were now standard throughout the aviation industry. 3 years ago, she began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium, "I was just another passenger on Flight 1247, trying to become someone I wasn't, running from responsibilities I thought I no longer wanted to carry. Today, I want to talk about what I learned from that experience and how it changed not just my life, but the way we approach aviation emergencies across the country." In the front row, she could see Admiral Hayes, now retired, but still actively involved in aviation safety initiatives. Captain Myers was there too, along with First Officer, now Captain Walsh, both of whom had become key collaborators in developing the civilian-military coordination protocols that had saved dozens of lives in the years since Flight 1247. "The most important lesson," Maya continued, "is that our greatest strengths often emerge from our most difficult experiences. The skills we develop during our darkest moments, the resilience we build when we think we can't go on, these become the foundation for helping others navigate their own challenges." 5 years later, the Maya Chen Center for Aviation Emergency Response had grown beyond a single facility, with training programs now operating worldwide. Maya's protocols had been implemented in over 40 countries, contributing to the successful resolution of hundreds of aviation emergencies and saving thousands of lives. 7 years later, Emma Morrison, now 24 and a first officer with United Airlines, keyed her radio as she prepared for takeoff from Denver International Airport. It was a routine flight to Seattle, the same route that had taken Maya away from her military career years earlier, though neither of them had planned the symbolic significance. Denver Tower, United 1847, ready for takeoff. United 1847, cleared for takeoff runway 16R. Have a good flight. As the Boeing 737 lifted off into the Colorado sky, Emma thought about the woman who had become her mentor, role model, and eventually her adopted aunt. Maya had never married or had children of her own, but she'd become a central figure in the lives of dozens of young pilots, including Emma, who had benefited from her guidance and support. In the passenger cabin, a nervous flyer in seat 14C was gripping his armrest as the plane climbed through some minor turbulence. Emma made a mental note to have the flight attendants check on him, one of many small lessons she'd learned from Maya about taking care of the people who trusted you with their lives. 10 years later, Maya, now 52 and director emeritus of the center that bore her name, sat in the cockpit of her restored 1967 Cessna, flying solo through the Colorado afternoon toward a small airport where she was scheduled to give a talk to a group of high school students interested in aviation careers. Her phone, secured in the mount beside her, buzzed with a message from Emma. Aunt Maya, just wanted you to know that I used your emergency communication protocols today when we had a radio failure over Chicago. Worked perfectly. All 156 passengers safe. On the ground. Thank you for teaching me that sometimes the most important thing a pilot can do is ask for help when they need it. Maya smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that came from knowing that the lessons she'd learned in her own moment of crisis were continuing to ripple outward, helping people she'd never meet navigate challenges she might never know about. She thought about Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose death had nearly broken her, and how his memory had become not a source of guilt, but a reminder of why the work mattered. She thought about Frank Reeves, whose simple faith had helped her find the courage to step forward when she'd wanted to hide. She thought about Captain Myers and First Officer Walsh, who had trusted her with their aircraft and their passengers' lives. Most of all, she thought about that stormy night when she'd been forced to choose between the safety of anonymity and the risk of responsibility, and how that choice had led her back to the person she was always meant to be. 15 years later, the auditorium at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum was packed for the dedication ceremony of the new exhibit, Flight 1247, How Crisis Creates Community. Maya, now in her late 50s with completely silver hair, but eyes that still held the sharp focus of a pilot, stood beside the actual cockpit section of the Boeing 737 that had been preserved and donated by United Airlines. Today we dedicate this exhibit not just to the crew and passengers of Flight 1247, Maya said to the assembled crowd, but to everyone who has ever found themselves in the position of having to choose between comfort and courage, between safety and service, between hiding from their past and embracing their purpose. In the audience, she could see faces that represented the full circle of her journey. Admiral Hayes, now in her 80s but still sharp and engaged. Captain Myers, retired but still teaching at the airline's training center. Emma Morrison, now a captain herself and director of training for United Airlines Western Region. Sarah Morrison, whose research on emergency psychology had influenced crisis response protocols far beyond aviation. But she also saw faces she didn't recognize, young pilots, students, aviation enthusiasts, and ordinary people who had been drawn to the story of how an ordinary flight had become an extraordinary example of human resilience and cooperation. The most important thing I learned that night, Maya concluded, is that we all carry within us the capacity to be more than we think we are. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal that capacity, but it's always there, waiting for the moment when someone needs us to step forward and be brave. As the ceremony ended and people began to file past the exhibit, Maya noticed a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, staring intently at the cockpit display. The girl's mother was trying to hurry her along, but the child was fascinated by the array of instruments and controls. "Are you interested in flying?" Maya asked, kneeling down to the girl's eye level. The girl nodded solemnly. My mom says airplanes are scary, but they don't look scary to me. They look like they're ready to go on adventures. Maya smiled, seeing something of her younger self in the child's fearless curiosity. What's your name? Rebecca. Rebecca Martinez. Maya's breath caught slightly at the last name. Colonel Martinez had been one of the unsung heroes of Flight 1247, the air traffic controller whose steady guidance had helped bring them home safely. She wondered if this was his granddaughter, carrying on a family tradition of service in her own unique way. Well, Rebecca Martinez, Maya said, would you like to know a secret about flying? The girl nodded eagerly. The most important thing about being a pilot isn't being fearless, Maya said. It's being willing to feel scared and do the right thing anyway. Can you remember that? Rebecca nodded seriously, and Maya had the sudden conviction that she was looking at someone who would carry that lesson forward into whatever challenges life might bring. 20 years later, Maya Chen, now in her early 60s and officially retired from active service, sat in her favorite chair on the deck of her mountain home, watching the sun set over the Colorado Rockies. Her phone buzzed with updates from emergency coordinators around the world, students who had become teachers, carrying forward the lessons learned on Flight 1247. She smiled, thinking about Frank Reeves and his simple faith, about Lieutenant Rodriguez and the weight of command, about all the ordinary people who had shown extraordinary courage when the moment demanded it. Her journey from passenger 14C to someone who stepped forward when others stepped back had been longer than she'd expected, but every challenge had led to this, a legacy of service that would continue long after she was gone. As she headed inside, Maya passed the framed photo she treasured most, the passengers and crew of Flight 1247 at their 10-year reunion, all of them together, all of them grateful to be alive and part of a story that had become larger than any of them had expected. She was no longer just another passenger in 14C. She was exactly who she was meant to be. Her phone rang, and she recognized the number immediately. Captain Martinez, she said, answering the call. How can I help you? Dr. Chen, came the young woman's voice, professional but warm. This is Rebecca Martinez, incident commander for the multi-aircraft emergency we discussed yesterday. I wanted to update you on the situation. Maya smiled, remembering the 8-year-old girl who had been fascinated by the Flight 1247 cockpit 20 years earlier. Rebecca had indeed become a pilot, then an air traffic controller, and eventually the director of emergency response for the entire southwestern United States. She had implemented Maya's protocols on a scale that Maya had never imagined possible. All 7 aircraft have landed safely, Rebecca continued. We used your distributed communication protocol to coordinate between civilian and military air traffic control across 3 states. No injuries, no damage, and the passengers probably don't even realize how close we came to a really serious situation. Outstanding work, Maya said, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that the lessons learned in crisis had continued to evolve and improve, saving lives in ways she might never fully know. Dr. Chen, Rebecca said, her voice becoming more personal, I wanted to thank you again for inspiring me to pursue this career. That day at the Smithsonian when I was 8, that conversation changed my life. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of all the years, all the challenges, all the moments when she'd had to choose between comfort and courage. Rebecca, she said, thank you for reminding me why it was all worth it. After ending the call, Maya sat quietly as darkness settled over the mountains. Tomorrow she would receive another group of visitors, family members of people who had been saved by the Flight 1247 protocols, coming to thank her for work she'd done decades earlier. Next week, she would speak at the graduation ceremony for a new class of emergency response coordinators, passing on lessons that had been learned through experience and paid for with risk. But tonight, she simply sat in the peaceful darkness, thinking about Frank Reeves and his simple faith, about Lieutenant Rodriguez and the price of leadership, about all the ordinary people who had shown extraordinary courage when the moment demanded it. Her phone buzzed with one final message of the day. From Emma Morrison. Aunt Maya, flying over Colorado Springs tonight on my way to Los Angeles. Looking down at the airport where you taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and helping people anyway. Love you. Maya smiled and typed back. Safe travels, Captain Morrison. Remember, some people run toward the sound of trouble, and the world needs more people like that. As she sent the message, Maya realized that Katie had been right all those years ago. She had been hiding from who she really was, trying to become someone ordinary when she was meant to be someone who stepped forward when others stepped back. The journey from that stormy night on Flight 1247 to this peaceful evening in the mountains had been longer and more complex than she could have imagined. But every challenge, every moment of doubt, every time she'd had to choose courage over comfort had led to this, a legacy of service that would continue long after she was gone, carried forward by people like Rebecca and Emma and countless others, whose names she might never know. Maya stood up from her chair and walked inside, where framed photos lined the hallway, pictures of flight crews, emergency responders, students who had become teachers, and ordinary people who had done extraordinary things when the situation demanded it. At the end of the hall was the photo she treasured most, the passengers and crew of Flight 1247, taken at their 10-year reunion, all of them together again, all of them grateful to be alive and part of the story that had become larger than any of them had expected. As she turned off the lights and headed toward bed, Maya felt the deep contentment that came from a life well lived, from responsibilities accepted rather than avoided, from a purpose discovered in the midst of crisis and carried forward through decades of service. She was no longer just another passenger in 14C. She was exactly who she was meant to be. 25 years later, the Maya Chen International Center for Aviation Crisis Management had grown beyond anything Maya could have envisioned. That stormy night on Flight 1247, what had started as a small training facility in Colorado Springs now spanned 5 continents, with specialized campuses in London, Tokyo, Sao Paulo, Dubai, and Johannesburg. Each facility carried the same mission statement etched in granite at its entrance, where ordinary people learn to do extraordinary things. Maya, now 77 but still sharp and engaged, stood in the main conference room of the original Colorado Springs facility, addressing the annual gathering of the International Association of Emergency Response Coordinators. The audience included presidents of airlines, military commanders, government officials, and emergency responders from around the world, all gathered to celebrate the 25th anniversary of what had become known simply as the Flight 1247 protocols. When I stepped into that cockpit 25 years ago, Maya began, her voice still strong despite her age, I thought I was helping with one emergency, one flight, one night. I had no idea that we were creating a template that would fundamentally change how the global aviation community responds to crisis situations. The statistics displayed on the screen behind her were staggering. In the quarter century since Flight 1247, the protocols developed from that emergency had been implemented in over 200 countries. They had been credited with saving over 50,000 lives in aviation emergencies ranging from simple radio failures to complex multi-aircraft disasters. The economic impact alone measured in lives not lost, aircraft not destroyed, and confidence in air travel maintained was estimated at over $30 billion. But for Maya, the numbers told only part of the story. The real legacy of Flight 1247 wasn't in statistics. It was in the countless individual moments when someone had chosen courage over comfort, action over inaction, service over self-preservation. The most important lesson we learned, Maya continued, wasn't technical or procedural, it was human. We learned that in moments of crisis, ordinary people are capable of extraordinary things, but only if we create systems that allow them to contribute their unique skills and perspectives. In the audience, she could see faces that represented the full breadth of that human impact. There was Captain Elena Vasquez, a former student who now ran the South American Training Center and had developed specialized protocols for high-altitude emergencies in the Andes. Dr. James Nakamura, a psychologist who had studied the Flight 1247 recordings and created new approaches to crisis communication that were now used by emergency responders worldwide. Commander Sarah al-Rashid, the first woman to head emergency response operations for the entire Middle East region, who credited Maya's example with inspiring her to pursue a career in aviation safety. But the person Maya was most proud to see was Rebecca Martinez, now 53, and serving as Director General of the International Civil Aviation Organization. The 8-year-old girl who had been fascinated by the Flight 1247 cockpit display had become one of the most powerful figures in global aviation, and she had never forgotten the lesson Maya had taught her about being scared and doing the right thing anyway. Dr. Chen, Rebecca said when Maya finished her presentation, on behalf of the international aviation community, I want to present you with this year's Lifetime Achievement Award for Aviation Safety. But more than that, I want to thank you for showing all of us that leadership isn't about rank or title. It's about being willing to step forward when people need you. As Maya accepted the crystal award shaped like an aircraft in flight, with the inscription, she was just another passenger until she chose to be more. She thought about all the people who had made this moment possible. Frank Reeves, whose simple faith had given her courage. Captain Myers and First Officer Walsh, who had trusted her with their aircraft and their passengers' lives. Colonel Martinez, whose steady guidance from the ground had helped her navigate that terrifying approach. Most of all, she thought about Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose death had nearly destroyed her, but whose memory had ultimately inspired her to build something that honored his sacrifice by preventing others from experiencing similar losses. 30 years later, the documentary Passenger 14C, The Maya Chen Story, premiered simultaneously in theaters worldwide and on streaming platforms, bringing the story of Flight 1247 to a new generation. Directed by Emma Morrison, now in her 50s, and one of the most respected airline executives in the industry, the film combined archival footage, dramatic reenactments, and interviews with survivors to tell the complete story of how one woman's decision to step forward had changed the world of aviation safety. Maya, now 82 and using a walker but still mentally sharp, attended the premiere at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences in Los Angeles. As she watched her younger self portrayed on screen by an actress who had spent months studying her mannerisms and speech patterns, Maya was struck by how different her perspective had become over the decades. The young woman on screen was terrified, struggling with guilt and self-doubt, desperately trying to escape the responsibilities that seemed to follow her wherever she went. But Maya could see now what she hadn't been able to see then, that every challenge, every moment of doubt, every time she'd wanted to run away had been preparing her for the moment when running was no longer an option. What strikes me most about Maya's story, Emma said during the post-screening discussion, is how it demonstrates that our greatest contributions often come not from our successes, but from how we respond to our failures and fears. Maya didn't become a hero because she was fearless. She became a hero because she was afraid and acted anyway. The film had been nominated for several Academy Awards, including Best Documentary Feature, but for Maya, the real validation came from the messages she received from viewers around the world. A young pilot in Nigeria wrote to thank her for inspiring him to speak up when he noticed a maintenance issue that might have been overlooked. A flight attendant in Australia credited Maya's example with giving her the confidence to take charge during a medical emergency at 35,000 feet. A teenager in Brazil said the film had convinced her to pursue a career in aviation, despite her family's concerns about the dangers of flying. Each of these messages, Maya told Emma after the premiere, represents someone who might have stayed silent, who might have assumed that someone else would handle the problem, who might have chosen safety over service. If our story helps even one person find the courage to step forward when they're needed, then everything we went through was worth it. 35 years later, Maya's 87th birthday celebration was held at the Colorado Springs airport, in the same terminal where she had once sat as a passenger trying to escape her past. The event had been organized by the Maya Chen Foundation, which had grown into one of the world's largest providers of emergency response training, with programs ranging from aviation safety to disaster relief to crisis communication. The guest list read like a who's who of international aviation and emergency response. There were airline CEOs, military commanders, government officials, and emergency responders from 6 continents. But Maya was most delighted by the presence of ordinary people whose lives had been touched by her work, flight attendants who had used her training to handle in-flight emergencies, air traffic controllers who had applied her communication protocols during equipment failures, and passengers who had survived dangerous situations because someone else had been trained to respond effectively. "When I think about Maya's legacy," said Dr. Rebecca Martinez in her keynote address, "I'm reminded of the ripple effect that physicists describe, how a single action can create waves that spread far beyond their point of origin, influencing events and people in ways that the original actor never could have imagined." Rebecca was right. The ripple effect of Flight 1247 had spread far beyond aviation. Maya's crisis communication protocols had been adapted for use by emergency responders, hospital staff, and disaster relief organizations. Her approaches to multi-agency coordination had been implemented by military units, law enforcement agencies, and international humanitarian organizations. The psychological principles she had helped develop were now taught in business schools as models for leadership under pressure. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Flight 1247 had become a cultural touchstone, a reminder that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, were capable of rising to meet any challenge if they had the courage to try. Maya always insisted that she wasn't a hero, Rebecca continued, that she was just someone who happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills. But I think she missed the point. Heroes aren't people who are naturally brave. Heroes are people who choose to be brave when bravery is needed. As Maya listened to the speeches and watched the video tributes from around the world, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 35 years ago, she had been running from responsibility, trying to become invisible, convinced that the world was better off without her involvement. Now she was surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been improved, sometimes saved by her decision to stop running and start engaging. The evening's most emotional moment came when Emma Morrison, now 60 and serving as CEO of United Airlines, presented Maya with a special gift, the actual seat from Flight 1247 seat 14T that had been preserved and mounted on a custom base with a plaque reading, "Where one woman's journey to find herself became everyone's journey to find hope." "This seat," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion, "represents the place where someone chose to be more than a passenger in her own life. It represents the moment when hiding became helping, when fear became courage, when one person's decision to act changed the world for countless others." Maya ran her fingers over the worn fabric of the seat, remembering that stormy night when everything had changed. She thought about all the other passengers who had sat in similar seats, facing their own moments of decision, their own opportunities to step forward or step back. "The truth is," Maya said when called upon to speak, "we're all passengers in seat 14C at some point in our lives. We all face moments when we have to choose between comfort and courage, between hiding and helping, between being ordinary and being extraordinary. The seat isn't what matters, it's what we choose to do when we're sitting in it. 40 years. Later, Maya Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep on a clear Colorado morning in late spring, surrounded by the mountain views she had loved for the better part of 4 decades. She was 92 years old and had remained active in aviation safety work until just weeks before her death, consulting on a new international protocol for coordinating emergency responses across multiple time zones. The news of her death made headlines around the world, not just in aviation publications, but in major newspapers, television networks, and social media platforms. The woman who had once tried so hard to disappear into anonymity had become an internationally recognized symbol of courage, service, and the power of ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Her funeral was held at the Air Force Academy Chapel, with full military honors and representatives from aviation organizations worldwide in attendance. The service was broadcast live on multiple networks and streamed online, allowing millions of people around the globe to pay their respects to the woman who had touched their lives, often in ways they had never fully realized. Maya Chen believed that heroism wasn't a destination but a choice, said Admiral Patricia Hayes, now 98, but still serving as chairman of the Maya Chen Foundation. Every day, in small ways and large, she chose to put others' needs ahead of her own comfort. She chose to share her knowledge rather than hoard it. She chose to build bridges rather than walls. She chose to turn her greatest failure into her greatest gift to the world. The eulogies painted a picture of a woman who had lived multiple lives: Navy pilot, software consultant, emergency response coordinator, teacher, mentor, and inspiration to millions. But all of those roles had been unified by a single thread: the belief that everyone had something valuable to contribute, and that the key to solving complex problems was bringing together people with different skills, perspectives, and experiences. Rebecca Martinez, now serving her second term as Director General of the International Civil Aviation Organization, delivered the final eulogy. Maya often said that she was just another passenger in seat 14C until circumstances forced her to be something more. Rebecca said, "But I think she had it backwards. She was always something more, she just needed the right moment to reveal it. And when that moment came, she didn't hesitate. She didn't make excuses. She didn't wait for someone else to take responsibility. She stepped forward, and in doing so, she showed all of us what stepping forward looks like." As Maya's casket was carried from the chapel by an honor guard that included pilots, air traffic controllers, emergency responders, and former students from around the world, fighter jets from her old Navy squadron performed a missing man formation. Overhead, a final salute to the pilot who had never stopped serving, even after she thought she had retired from service. 45 years later, the Maya Chen Institute for Emergency Leadership had become one of the world's most prestigious training facilities, with graduates serving in leadership positions across every industry and every continent. The Institute's campus in Colorado Springs had grown to encompass over 500 acres, with specialized training facilities, research laboratories, and dormitories that hosted students from around the world. But the heart of the campus remained the original building, which housed the Maya Chen Memorial Museum. The centerpiece of the museum was the preserved cockpit of Flight 1247, exactly as it had been on that stormy night 45 years earlier, with the instruments showing the readings from the moment Maya had taken control of the aircraft. Dr. Emma Morrison, now 75 and serving as Director Emeritus of the Institute, led a group of new students through the museum on their first day of classes. The students came from every corner of the globe and every walk of life: military officers, corporate executives, emergency responders, teachers, healthcare workers, and recent college graduates who had been inspired by Maya's story to pursue careers in service to others. "This cockpit represents the moment when everything changed," Emma told the students as they gathered around the display. Not just for the passengers and crew of Flight 1247, but for all of us. This is where one woman decided that being ordinary wasn't enough, that being a passenger in life wasn't acceptable when people needed someone to take the controls. The students listened intently, many of them taking notes, others simply absorbing the atmosphere of the place, where their hero had made the decision that had shaped their own career choices. They came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and brought different skills and perspectives to their studies. But they all shared one thing in common: the belief that they had a responsibility to use their talents in service of something larger than themselves. Maya Chen never asked to be a hero, Emma continued. She just happened to be in the right place at the right time with the right skills and the courage to use them. But here's the thing, we're all in the right place at the right time with the right skills. The only question is whether we'll have the courage to use them when we're needed. One of the students, a young woman from Bangladesh named Fatima Rahman, raised her hand. Professor Morrison, what made Maya different from other people? What made her able to step forward when others might have stayed in their seats? Emma smiled, remembering the many times she had asked Maya that same question over the years. Maya always said it wasn't that she was braver than other people, Emma replied. It was that she had learned to be afraid and act anyway. She had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to do what's right despite the fear. The tour continued through other exhibits, displays showing the evolution of emergency response protocols, interactive simulations that allowed visitors to experience crisis decision-making, and a wall of photographs showing the thousands of people around the world who had been trained using methods developed from the Flight 1247 experience. But the exhibit that always moved visitors most was the simple display near the exit seat 14C from Flight 1247, with a placard that read, "She was just another passenger until she chose to be more. What will you choose to be?" 50 years later, the 50th anniversary of Flight 1247 was marked by a week-long International Symposium on Crisis Leadership, held simultaneously at Maya Chen Institute campuses around the world and connected by satellite and internet technology. That would have seemed like science fiction to the passengers and crew of that Boeing 737 half a century earlier. The keynote speaker was Dr. Fatima Rahman, now Director General of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and one of the world's leading experts on crisis communication and emergency response. She had been inspired to pursue her career by Maya's story, and her work coordinating international responses to natural disasters had saved countless lives across the globe. 50 years ago, Fatima said, addressing an audience that included emergency responders, government officials, and students from around the world, a woman named Maya Chen made a choice that changed the trajectory of global emergency response. She chose to step forward when she could have stayed seated. She chose to help when she could have remained hidden. She chose to accept responsibility when she could have deferred to others. The audience included many people who had never heard of Flight 1247 before attending the symposium, but who had been affected by its legacy in ways they were only beginning to understand. The doctor in Mumbai who had used Maya's crisis communication protocols during a hospital emergency. The teacher in Sao Paulo who had applied Maya's leadership principles during a school evacuation. The engineer in Lagos who had implemented Maya's multi-agency coordination methods during an industrial accident. But Maya's greatest contribution, Fatima continued, wasn't the specific protocols she developed or the lives she directly saved. Her greatest contribution was demonstrating that leadership isn't about titles or positions or formal authority. Leadership is about recognizing when you're needed and having the courage to respond. The symposium featured presentations on the latest developments in emergency response technology, case studies of successful crisis interventions, and workshops on applying the Flight 1247 principles to new and emerging challenges. But the most powerful moments came during the personal testimonials, stories from people whose lives had been changed by Maya's example, either directly or through the ripple effects of her influence. There was the story of Captain Li Wei, a Chinese airline pilot who had saved 200 passengers during a hydraulic failure by using techniques he had learned at a Maya Chen Institute training program. The account of Dr. Sarah Okafor, a Nigerian emergency room physician who had coordinated a multi-hospital response to a terrorist attack using communication protocols based on Maya's work. The testimony of Maria Gonzalez, a Mexican emergency dispatcher who had guided firefighters through a complex urban rescue using decision-making frameworks developed from the Flight 1247 experience. Each story was different, but they all shared common themes. Ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances, choosing to act rather than wait for someone else to take responsibility, using their skills and knowledge in service of something larger than themselves. When Maya Chen stepped into that cockpit 50 years ago, Fatima concluded, she couldn't have known that she was creating a template that would influence emergency response around the world for decades to come. She was just trying to help get one airplane safely to the ground. But that's the power of choosing to do the right thing in the moment. You never know how far the ripples will spread. As the symposium concluded, participants were invited to sign a pledge inspired by Maya's example. I commit to stepping forward when I am needed, to using my skills in service of others, and to choosing courage over comfort when circumstances demand it. The pledge was signed by thousands of people from every continent, every profession, and every walk of life. Some were already serving in leadership positions, others were just beginning their careers, and still others were simply ordinary citizens who had been inspired to think differently about their responsibilities to their communities and their world. 50-5 years later, the Maya Chen Center for Global Crisis Response had evolved beyond its aviation origins to become the world's premier institution for studying and teaching leadership in emergency situations. The center's research had contributed to improvements in everything from natural disaster response to pandemic preparedness to international conflict resolution. Dr. James Morrison, Emma's nephew and now director of the center, stood in the same auditorium where Maya had given her first presentation half a century earlier. He was addressing a gathering of world leaders, including presidents, prime ministers, and heads of international organizations, who had come to Colorado Springs to discuss the challenges of coordinating global responses to climate change, emerging diseases, and other threats that transcended national boundaries. My great-aunt Maya used to say that the most important lesson of Flight 1247 wasn't technical, it was human. James told the assembled leaders. She learned that people perform best in crisis situations when they feel connected to something larger than themselves, when they understand how their individual actions contribute to the collective solution, and when they trust that their leaders are willing to share both responsibility and risk. The principles that Maya had discovered in the cockpit of a damaged airliner had proven applicable to challenges far beyond aviation. Climate scientists were using her multi-agency coordination protocols to organize international research efforts. Public health officials had adapted her communication frameworks to manage disease outbreaks. Diplomats were applying her conflict resolution techniques to prevent and resolve international disputes. The challenges we face today, global warming, pandemic diseases, international terrorism, cyber warfare, are all Flight 1247 situations, James continued. They require us to work together across traditional boundaries, to share information and resources in real time, and to make decisions quickly based on incomplete information while lives hang in the balance. The world leaders listened intently, many of them taking notes, others asking detailed questions about how Maya's principles could be applied to their specific situations. They represented different political systems, different cultural backgrounds, and different national interests, but they all shared a common challenge: how to lead effectively when the stakes were high. Information was limited and traditional. Approaches were insufficient. The most important thing Maya taught us, James concluded, is that leadership in crisis isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions, to listen to people with different perspectives and expertise, and to take action even when you're afraid of making mistakes. As the summit continued over the following days, the participants worked together to develop new frameworks for international cooperation in emergency situations. They drew on Maya's insights about the importance of clear communication, shared responsibility, and mutual trust, adapting these principles to the unique challenges of governing in an interconnected world. The summit concluded with the signing of the Colorado Springs Accord, a landmark agreement that established new protocols for international cooperation during global emergencies. The accord was based explicitly on the Flight 1247 principles, creating mechanisms for rapid information sharing, coordinated decision-making, and joint action that transcended traditional diplomatic and bureaucratic barriers. Maya Chen stepped into a cockpit 55 years ago to help with one emergency, said UN Secretary-General Amara Diallo during the signing ceremony. Today, we are applying the lessons she learned to help our entire planet navigate the emergencies of the 21st century. 60 years later, on the 60th anniversary of Flight 1247, the story had become legend. Maya Chen was studied in leadership courses, quoted in crisis management textbooks, and cited in academic papers on everything from organizational psychology to international relations. Her image appeared on postage stamps in dozens of countries, and her quotes were inscribed on monuments and buildings around the world. But perhaps the most fitting tribute was the simplest: a small bronze plaque installed at Gate 14C in airports around the world, with the inscription, "She was just another passenger until she chose to be more. What will you choose to be?" The plaques have been installed by a grassroots movement of aviation workers, emergency responders, and ordinary travelers who had been inspired by Maya's story. They served as quiet reminders to the millions of people who passed by them every day that heroism wasn't about superpowers or special abilities. It was about making the choice to help when help was needed. The anniversary was marked by celebrations and commemorations around the world, but the most meaningful event was held in the same terminal at Colorado Springs Airport where Maya had once sat as a passenger trying to escape her past. The event was small and intimate, attended by just a few dozen people who had been personally touched by Maya's story or inspired by her example. Rebecca Martinez, now in her 80s but still sharp and engaged, served as the master of ceremonies. 60 years ago, she said, a woman named Maya Chen taught us that we're all just passengers until we choose to be something more. Today, we celebrate not just her memory, but the countless people around the world who have made that same choice. The attendees included some of Maya's last surviving contemporaries, people who had known her personally and worked with her to develop the protocols and institutions that had grown from the Flight 1247 experience. But most of the audience consisted of younger people whose lives had been shaped by Maya's legacy. Emergency responders who had been trained using her methods, leaders who had applied her principles in their own fields, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by her example to step forward when they were needed. As the ceremony concluded, the attendees were invited to participate in a tradition that had developed over the years, taking a moment to sit in silence in seat 14C from Flight 1247, which had been installed in the airport terminal as a permanent memorial. Each person who sat in the seat was asked to reflect on their own moments of choice, their own opportunities to step forward or step back, their own decisions to be passengers or pilots in their own lives. The last person to sit in the memorial seat was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, who had attended the ceremony with her grandmother. As she sat quietly for a moment, the girl's grandmother whispered to her, What do you think Maya would want you to remember? The girl was quiet for a long moment, then said, I think she would want me to remember that being scared is okay, but letting scared stop you from helping people isn't okay. It was, everyone agreed, exactly what Maya would have wanted them to remember. As the sun set over the Colorado Rockies that evening, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, the spirit of Maya Chen lived on in the countless people around the world who had learned from her example. They were doctors and teachers, pilots and engineers, parents and students, leaders and followers, all united by the understanding that they had a responsibility to use their gifts in service of something larger than themselves. They were no longer just passengers in seat 14C. They had chosen to be more. And in doing so, they honored the memory of the woman who had shown them that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act with purpose despite the fear. The legacy of Flight 1247 would continue as long as there were people willing to step forward when they were needed, to choose service over safety, to accept responsibility rather than deflect it. Maya Chen had started something that could never be finished, only passed on from one generation to the next, one choice at a time, one moment of courage at a time. Her story had become everyone's story, and her choice had become an invitation, extended to every person who ever found themselves in their own version of seat 14C, facing their own moment of decision between comfort and courage. The invitation was simple. Will you choose to be just another passenger, or will you choose to be something more? The answer, as Maya had learned that stormy night 60 years earlier, was always up to them. And now, dear listeners, as we reach the end of this incredible journey through Maya Chen's life and legacy, I want to invite each of you to consider your own seat 14C moment. We all face times when we can choose to remain passengers in our own lives, or step forward and take control when others need us most. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the extraordinary potential that lies within ordinary moments, then I ask you to do two things. First, share this story with someone who might need to hear it, someone who might be hiding from their own calling, someone who might be afraid to step forward when they're needed most. And second, subscribe to our channel, where we bring you stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that remind us that heroism isn't about superpowers or special abilities. It's about making the choice to help when help is needed most. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because every week we bring you new stories of courage, service, and the ripple effects that occur when someone chooses to be more than just another passenger in life. Subscribe to my channel, where silence is never forgotten, and where every story reminds us that we all have the power to be heroes in someone else's story.